Susan. Hi, I'm Mikki, and this is Mikkipedia, where I sit down and chat to doctors, professors, athletes, practitioners, and experts in their fields related to health, nutrition, fitness, and well-being. And I'm delighted that you're here. Morning peeps, hope you've had a great week. Now today I'm super excited to bring to you my conversation that I had with a woman I really admire who has been in the nutrition space forever. She has such a wealth of experience with elite top level athletes right down to your everyday person who just wants to be active and optimize their health and well-being through food. Now I'm speaking to Dr. Susan Kleiner, and Dr. Kleiner is the owner of High Performance Nutrition, which is a consulting firm in Mercer Island in Washington, and she's currently the High Performance Nutrition Consultant to the Seattle Storm. She's also consulted with many professional teams and team members, including the Seattle Reign, Seattle Seahawks, Seattle Mariners, Seattle Thunderbirds, and the Seattle Supersonics. Dr. Kleiner is also the author of 8 books, including the bestseller The New Power Eating, The Good Mood Diet, and The Power Food Nutrition Plan. And today, Susan and I have a really in-depth conversation about what it was like to be part of the sports nutrition field before it was even known as sports nutrition. It wasn't even a field when Susan got started in it and conducted her PhD looking at muscle. And her initial doctoral studies really influenced the decisions she made as a consultant and built the foundation for the rest of her career. And we talk a lot about that as well. Our conversation also details how she was one of the co-founders of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, which is one of my trusted, credible sources that I look to for the most up-to-date and relevant science-backed information in and around the sports nutrition field. And it was such an honor to be able to spend time talking to Susan, and I really hope that you enjoy this interview. Good morning, Susan. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Mikki. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And I say good morning, though it is afternoon at both of our respective places, you being in Seattle and me in Auckland. And firstly, I'd just like to say thank you so much for taking some time to chat to me today. I have been a long-term follower of your work and always catch your podcasts, and I'm really interested in what you've got on Facebook and a whole host of things, including, of course, your academic publications. And you are certainly someone who has been in the field for many years now, and with that comes a wealth of experience.
Well, it was really fun to be at the beginning of a profession. That, I have to say, was an exciting time. It was kind of a heady time. I finished my PhD in 1987. When I began my master's degree in 1980, we weren't really using the term sports nutrition yet. And my PhD is in nutrition and human performance.
As I understand it, your PhD is looking at physique athletes or bodybuilders and the use of steroids. Am I right? And physiological processes?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. How does a female get into that kind of topic? And I know that sounds like a weird question, but it just seems so forward thinking, right?
So I was a biology major, and I was very interested in health and thought I wanted to go to medical school because there really wasn't a path around prevention yet. There was a magazine from Rodale publishers that was called Prevention, but in the health field, the terminology didn't really exist much around prevention. And so I thought, well, I have to go to medical school to become a physician and then really study health.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, a very good friend of mine's dad was the dean of admissions of the Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where I live. And he said to me, we'd love to have you in medical school. You'll learn nothing about what you're interested in. You're interested in health. We teach people how to treat disease. Go talk to the Department of Nutrition, which was completely eye-opening for me because I thought nutrition was just a hobby. So I mean, clearly, had I gone to a large university, there would have been a Department of Nutrition and I would have known all of that. But I went to a very small liberal arts college with a very heavy focus on research, not sending people off to medical school or professional school. So the idea of studying muscle and how muscle worked, what we needed to do to feed muscle to help it grow was a question. And as I went through my master's degree and came right back, I became a registered dietitian and came right back for my doctorate. That was my interest of how do you make muscle grow? And the studying that was going on at the time was in sort of the early days where dietitians and nutrition scientists were involved so that the methodology was good, was in the area of aerobic exercise. We were understanding that cardiovascular health, that nutrition played a role. It was the very early days, 1980, 1981, 1982. We only were just having the consensus conference that diet even played a role in health and in cardiovascular disease. And so the research was around people were running and jogging and cycling. And that's where the fueling research really was. I had the opportunity to be at the Cleveland Clinic, where a foundation where they were doing, they were the medical professionals associated with the NFL team, the Cleveland Browns, where, there was a number of work being done with athletes, and Dr. John Lombardo was unique in the medical profession as a sports medicine physician. He was actually a family practice doc in sports medicine, and he believed that even athletes who used anabolic steroids deserved medical care. And if it may be hard to imagine today that was novel, that was trend breaking, that a bona fide physician would knowingly treat an athlete using anabolic steroids, which at the time weren't even illegal, to be honest. It's just that it was certainly considered cheating. And so also at that time was the very early days of the HIV epidemic, the AIDS epidemic. And the man who was treating these patients with a disease that we didn't know what it was, an autoimmune disease that we didn't know or had something to do with the immune system. HIV had not been identified yet, the virus. Dr. Len Calabrese, he was the doctor, basically the immunologist between New York City and Chicago. We were in Cleveland, who was treating all of these patients, and no one knew what to do with them, and they were all wasting away. And he was also interested in sports. And so the confluence of those two things led him to question whether you could give patients anabolic steroids and that would keep them from wasting away. And so, but no one had asked the question, what was the influence of anabolic steroids on immune function? I was interested in what were the nutritional needs of athletes taking anabolic steroids, because they clearly did something. Although we were talking about them as if they weren't doing anything in the medical world. And so I sort of dropped in to his study, where he definitely had to look at nutritional adequacy in these athletes who were taking steroids, and then look at what was the impact on immune function. And I wanted to look at steroid using bodybuilders to see what was the influence of diet versus anabolic steroids. And so that's where this huge study then came together that I had an unbelievable opportunity as a young green PhD student to create and write my own research, to get my own research funding, which was a plus and a minus. I mean, most people drop into a funded situation, but it really was a very exciting time where we were trying to understand what really were anabolic steroids doing, what was the role that diet played, how could you make a healthier athlete and keep them championship level, and so and what were the mechanisms of muscle growth. And so I was really doing more of an observational study, but it led to the beginning of all this research because it finally gave us real data on what were these athletes eating, what drugs were they taking, a thorough description of the garbage bags full of drugs that they were taking, and the impact on many clinical parameters that we looked at. And so that's how, I mean, it was my question. I did start to bodybuild at that time. I was introduced by a female bodybuilder to bodybuilding. I never got into the performative aspects of it. I was purely fascinated with what the body could do. And if you studied these extremes, what would it teach us about anybody who did that kind of exercise?
And so you obviously had a personal interest in kind of muscle growth, muscle building, and obviously with your studies as well as a registered dietitian. What were your habits like back then, Susan? If you can kind of think back, did you learn, were the things that you learned in your PhD, were they kind of eye-opening to you? Did they change what you did or how you coached others?
It was fascinating. There were so many things. So I had come out of the world of dance personally. So I was a pre-Title IX girl, meaning in this country, there was almost no organized sports opportunities through school for girls in sports, particularly in the Midwest. And so I was a modern dancer. I had trained, I hadn't danced professionally, but I had gone to New York to study at 16 years old. So I really did have sort of high hopes, but then recognized I really wanted to learn more and go to college. So I came home. In my sort of journey into bodybuilding, I had started doing all different kinds of sports in college, but then into the bodybuilding, just the feeling of strength and power that I got from lifting was just a wonderful feeling and gave me tremendous respect, because I actually was in the gym with some seriously training athletes. Cleveland, Ohio, it was and remains a main area for the building of highly competitive athletes. And so, and all of Ohio is. So I had firsthand knowledge of what these men and women were doing physically for their training, yet within the sort of exercise science and exercise physiology community, there was really no knowledge of what these athletes were doing, and a pretty, I guess the nice way to put it was kind of an elitist attitude by people who worked with athletes who were in competitive sports toward athletes who were in the bodybuilding world. And so there were a lot of negative attitudes toward them. And so the first thing I learned was these were some highly trained athletes training at serious levels. They were not guzzling beer drinkers, smoking cigarettes, and they did drugs, but they were not doing what everyone thought they were doing. They were, very focused on their diet, very focused on their training. They certainly didn't smoke, and most of them didn't drink. And so that was one piece. Next was, what did they do with their diets? And there were some jaw-dropping things that I saw. I mean, the volume of fat in the diet. Now, this is the mid-1980s, where athlete, especially the big male bodybuilders that I was working with, the, sort of heavyweights, were eating pounds of meat a day. They were drinking a gallon of whole milk a day. They were eating a dozen eggs, usually raw, in a shake a day. And so the volume of fat was extreme compared to, very high compared to what we were starting to talk about, to be careful with the fat in your diet because of cardiovascular disease. Yet, in most of these athletes, despite their steroid use, when they were off of steroids, when they would cycle off, so they'd cycle on and off, when they were off, their cholesterol levels, their other clinical parameters looked fairly good. So, along with that, there were a number of other things that made us think that muscle building exercise must have some health benefits. Now, prior to this, there was no mention of anything like that you had to be doing cardiovascular exercise, aerobic, what we recognize as aerobic exercise then. Today, we understand that weightlifting also is cardiovascular, that it's working and pumping your heart, that it's working your muscles. There's so many things that we understand today that we had no knowledge of then. This was just like a shadow, a window of, there's something here that must be health promoting, or else these athletes would look much worse than they do, because they did no cardiovascular exercise in those days.
Did you do any yourself as you got into this kind of muscle building from a physique perspective? Were you also doing any kind of cardio type work, Susan, or were you predominantly just focused on building muscle?
Well, because I wasn't thinking about getting on a stage, I wasn't really influenced by that level of training. On the one hand, certainly not using drugs, and the other was, I enjoyed so many personal sports, and so I loved to cycle. I did some running. I continued to dance. I was still taking dance lessons during that time. We did a lot of hiking. I had started whitewater kayaking. I mean, I was doing a lot of fun things that were becoming popular at the time. And so, I was not, sort of training in the image of my subjects. Funny story, neither was my husband. So my husband has always been more of that lean looking distance athlete type. He's the one who taught me to kayak. He was somewhat competitive at that time, built his own kayaks. He was much more of a distance style athlete on his bicycle. Cross country skiing was the off season, the opposite of when we kayaked. Anyway, I had gone to the movies one night, and my husband was with me, and a number of the subjects, they were friends of each other, and we saw them outside the theater. And, hey, Doc, and I said, I want to introduce you to my husband. And they all give him this very strange look, like, who is this skinny guy who you've got with you? Like, what's up with that? So that was, so my world was a real combination.
Yeah. And it's the, and I suppose from your kind of initial beginnings with both your personal interest and obviously your study in sports nutrition has led you to become one of the most revered sports nutritionists in the States. And you work with a number of high performing athletes, and particularly team sport athletes, right?
Everything. So I do team sport athletes. I work with, I always say I'll work with anybody. Number one, they have to exercise. And, I don't know how to help you if you don't exercise, because to me, weight loss is not a goal, it's an outcome. And so if you are coming to me to lose weight and you're talking about a diet, but you don't exercise, I can't work with you. However, I do say that anyone who wants to achieve peak performance, from the courtroom to the boardroom to the bedroom, as well as on the field of sport, I can work with you. So it's a huge range of people: elite athletes, professional athletes, Olympians, recreational athletes, even youth athletes, not very young. Usually the youngest I'll work with is high school, but certainly collegiate athletes and anybody else. I've worked with pilots, I've worked with CEOs of industry, I've worked with, all kinds of adults who, kind of left their athletic identity behind and started a family, went to work, and all of a sudden recognized that this really isn't the life that they want. And they want to be healthy and fit it all in, but they can't figure out how to do it. And so I work with them as well.
Yeah, it's, and what I found really interesting when I was looking at your profile, Susan, was just that you were right there at the beginning of sports nutrition, and you sat around like a table with like Jose Antonio, for example, and we're like, right, we're going to start something here. And because you're a co-founder of the International Society of Sports Nutrition, correct?
Correct.
How did that come about? Like what kind of conversations were going on?
Well, that's a funny, there's so many funny stories. So I had been, I am a registered dietitian. I had been a member of what was originally the American Dietetic Association, today the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. I am no longer a member, but at that time I was a member, and I was a member of SCAN, the Sports and Cardiovascular Nutritionist Practice Group. Was really the only home for people doing sports nutrition, but you had to be an ADA member. You had to be a registered dietitian. And, by the 1990s, for sure, I had colleagues that knew a lot about nutrition and nutrition science, for sure, in the world of exercise science and exercise physiology, and even in the world of personal training and coaching. Well, how were those people supposed to be able to have a conversation with their clients or their athletes without any training? The sense of territorial, control didn't sit well with me. That was the first thing. The second was that it wasn't just that, but it was the ability to get a good education to all of these people who, as registered dietitians, we would never have enough numbers to meet the need. And so to leave the registered dietitian as the specialist, but to have some basic education, as I said, for coaches, for trainers, for physical therapists, for all kinds of people who are always on the front lines of talking to people on a daily basis, and be able to give them some good basic knowledge. There really wasn't yet very much of that available. And so I had gotten very frustrated, and we had a SCAN meeting where actually Dr. Doug Coleman, prior to being Dr. Coleman, was the program director for that SCAN meeting. Doug is a registered dietitian. He was quite active in SCAN. And SCAN also very much focused, as I said, the focus of the profession as a whole was on aerobic and cardiovascular training. And so even though I had been a member of SCAN since like 1982, 83, the very early days, I had never been asked to speak. And all of us in this world where we were really doing work in strength and power, there was never a conference that had any interest in bringing those speakers. When Doug was the program director, he invited all of us. So it was me, it was Joey, Antonio, Dr. Antonio, it was Dr. Rick Kreider. I believe that Marie Spano was there. She was always at the conferences. And so I don't actually even remember the full group of people who were there, but we were all sitting around a big table at dinner. We had all gone out like for Chinese or something, and it was kind of a moment of frustration for me, saying, how are all these people, including industry, how is industry ever supposed to recognize and understand why they should be doing research if they're not at the table when research presentations are being done? And so I kind of, in frustration, kind of yelled out, we should just start our own organization. I'm tired of the exclusivity on the knowledge. And so everybody laughed and said, Sue, you're crazy. And about 3 months later, Dr. Antonio called me and he said, were you serious? Did you really mean that we should start a new organization? And I said, yes. And that was the beginning. So the founders were myself, Dr. Antonio, Dr. Kalman, Dr. Kreider, and Anthony Almada. Anthony Almada at that time, I believe, was still working with EAS. He was a co-founder of the highly successful supplement company, EAS, that had brought creatine kind of certainly to the US. So that's the beginning of ISSN.
Yeah. And, like it's one of my kind of go-tos with regards to, staying current with research in and around sports nutrition, but also just nutrition in general as it relates to humans as athletes. Because, I feel like there is so much crossover between how we talk to athletes about nutrition, but also really good practices and principles that kind of the everyday person can also, take on board. Because oftentimes people think that nutrition related information in and around strength, in and around power is, the domain of your strength and power athlete, without actually thinking about, in terms of us being healthy and growing old, but being healthy, like a large, there's so much crossover in that space, Susan.
Yes. And, relative to the question I didn't really answer, which was, have I changed the way I speak to clients because of the research subjects that I had? Well, very much so. I mean, at that time, I really learned, and it was to the, I had this tremendous advantage of having these incredible clinicians who were my mentors and guides, Dr. Calabrese, Dr. Lombardo, Dr. Kirkendall, who was the exercise physiologist. How you speak to your clients in a non-judgmental way, because they were judged all the time. They were, sort of outcasts of the athletic world because they were bodybuilders. They were outcasts and they lived, which was a subculture of itself. And then the subculture beneath that of the drug use. And when it came to female bodybuilders, even far more secretive. So my research continued, and I went from my doctoral research with male bodybuilders to working with female bodybuilders also in the 1980s. And that really was a very secretive sort of society, even amongst each other at that time. So learning to speak to people without any judgment, to really learn what are they doing, why are they doing it, and what are they open to exploring, to experiment with a different way, and how much leeway do you have in helping them move along that continuum from where they are now to where they'd like to go. And that has remained a foundational part of my practice always, and really my interaction with people in general for the rest of my life. As far as the how do you eat for strength and power, you couldn't be more right on. I mean, it's when I wrote the original Power Eating, people really did see it as, in its own category, its own lane. This is for strength and power athletes. It's never going to affect a runner or a cyclist or a rower or any, this is for people who want to be play hockey or play football, or or track and field, the athletes that are the strength and power athletes. So it's in its 5th edition is the new power eating. It is used by all athletes at all levels of sport, at all ages, and I talk about it as sports agnostic.
Nice.
That no matter who you are, and even if you don't see yourself as an athlete, but you just want to live a longer, healthier life and maintain your independence, it applies to you too.
So what are those principles, Susan? So if you're working with someone, and let's just, even like the language is the same across the board and the principles are the same, regardless of whether they're Gen Pop or elite athlete. Obviously the goals will be different, but what are some fundamental principles that you use if you're talking to someone about improving body composition?
Overall, I kind of have an overarching paradigm that I call the power eating paradigm. And it's built on the philosophy of abundance, not restriction, or that there's just not enough to go around, that we have to be smaller.
Yeah.
And so in thinking about abundance rather than scarcity, and scarcity meaning that having the body that you want is a scarce thing, then you have to fuel your body. You have to increase your fuel to have enough energy so that you can train hard.
Yeah.
Which is what builds muscle.
Yeah.
Which ultimately increases performance. And if you need to lose fat, you will.
Well, interesting. I saw one of your earlier papers, and I believe it was published in 2003 or 2004. It was a case study of, I believe it was an NBA basketball player. Do you want to describe to us kind of, if you can remember it? I'm sorry, I know it.
Sure. Oh yeah. Yeah, I remember it. I don't think I forget a client.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all so unique. But yes, and this was a very difficult case. I was called in to work with, a 5-time all-star NBA athlete.
Mm-hmm.
I believe he was nearly 7 feet tall, about 6'11 and a half, something like that. A young man in his early 20s or maybe mid 20s. And he I was called in, it was just after the NBA lockout. So the athletes had called a strike.
Mm-hmm.
And the owners association locked them out.
Mm-hmm.
And said, if you're going to strike, we're not going to negotiate, and we're going to shut down the season. And so they were not allowed to go into the facilities and train. They weren't really supposed to have contact with their coaches at all. They were kind of left on their own. And these are very young men, right? With more money than they should have at that age and be alone.
Yeah.
With no advice on what to do with it. And I don't begrudge a penny that they get. But as I said, without good guidance, they can get themselves into trouble.
Yeah.
And so this was after that lockout. They came back, and this athlete was overweight and undertrained.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there probably were many of the athletes that were in that situation. This athlete had also sort of evolved into other personal issues in his life during this time. Again, not having very good guidance. And I was called in to work with him. He wasn't showing up to practices. He did have a contract weight and a contract body composition that he had to meet, and he wasn't meeting either of those.
Was that
normal?
As I said, he wasn't time?
A contract weight.
Yeah.
Sometimes yes and no. It depended on the athlete. If they thought that I wasn't that familiar with all the different athlete contracts at that time. It seemed a little unusual in a male NBA player's contract to have that, but maybe somebody, for whatever reason, he was one of the highest paid athletes at the time. So maybe his contract was a little different.
Yeah.
He wasn't showing up. His play was terrible. And they called me in to see the strength and conditioning coach knew of me and called and said, can you come in and maybe help us with this athlete? So I went in, and it took, 20 minutes to recognize that this athlete was actually, although I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not certified in clinical diagnosis, but he certainly seemed clinically depressed to me.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that had been happening is that they had started weighing him regularly.
Mm.
So every other day, he knew that when he showed up to practice, they were going to put him on the scale. Well, what does anybody do? They stop eating.
Yeah.
Right? And so he's not eating, but his body fat is going up, and nobody can figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
So the combination of things, along with, and this may give it away if anyone reads the case study and is knowledgeable of NBA players at the time, they will figure out who this is. He also was obviously drinking too much alcohol.
Yeah.
And so I had to become sort of his nutritional psychologist without any psych training to speak of. But he was incredibly motivated and responsive. And everything that I did with him, he responded to. But to understand, I started working with him. And you may recall better having just read it, he was eating like 1,500 or 1,800 calories a day.
Yeah. That's what I saw in your case study. You had written that, that very low, you gave a sample kind of what his diet looked like. And there was some clear patterns actually within it that is not unfamiliar to me as I work with a number of athletes, and how you described his pattern of no breakfast, of, this was obviously his kind of weight loss, don't want to eat pattern, no breakfast, no idea when training was actually, but then there was lunch, there was snack, there was dinner, and in total about that 1,500 to 1,700 kilocalories per day. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So he was well on his way to an eating disorder.
Yeah.
And who would have thought that a 7-foot young, 26-year-old NBA athlete could be on his way to an eating disorder? I mean, especially, thinking about when this was, this was way outside anything anyone had ever described before. And so what had real clarity, and what we understood even then, was get this guy off the scale.
Yeah.
And explain what's happening, that the reason his body composition is going south is because he's dropping muscle day by day as he's walking around. The reason he's not coming to practice is because he has no energy to get out of bed. And so I put him on, I think we started at around 5,000 calories. We brought it down to 4,500, I believe. Certainly got his drinking under control. Made them stop putting him on the scale, and he actually did. And so then he had the energy to get out of bed and go to his training and show up and do all the things he needed to do. And I have never seen a transformation of a body so quickly. And what it told me is, when you put everything in, that was the beginning of my experimentation with the neurobiology of food as well. So this was the late 80s.
Yeah.
And I was reading, because I thought, I have this depressed athlete. I have to do something other than just feed him in general. There must be things that I can do. And so that's when I started with 5 salmon meals a day, where here we are in Seattle, we could do that. We added eggs back into his diet. There were so many things, the egg yolk being so important, nuts being so important, so many things where I could see where it interacted with brain function, also gut function. And so the ground flaxseed every day, there were, but I threw everything into one diet. You couldn't experiment. There was no time. We had 7 weeks, I believe, or 9 weeks to get him that's all they gave me, or else he was going to be off contract.
Now, obviously, this is a while ago. Do you remember being nervous, like going, "Oh my goodness, this is on me with this person," or were you like quite confident that you could see what was going on and then, steer him right?
I was angry.
Yeah.
I was very angry because I came out of my first meeting with him and I said, this guy needs a clinical therapist.
Yeah.
And they said, no way. Because if the press hears that he's getting any kind of psych help,
Yeah.
we'll never be able to trade him.
Yeah.
And our goal is to trade this guy. And your job is to get him into shape so we can trade him.
Wow.
And so I called the agent and I said, you need to get this guy some psych help.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, no way, my pocketbook is on the line.
Yeah.
And then, I wasn't allowed to reach out to his family. He asked me not to do that. But I was so angry because here was someone worth a fortune to the team that was making them money.
Yeah.
And now was a deficit, but even so, he's a human being.
Yeah.
And it was all on me to get him both refed and emotionally and mentally healthy.
Yeah.
And I knew I didn't really have the skill to do that. Ultimately, we had such a wonderful relationship that we got him where he needed to go. And as I said, he had to do it.
Yeah.
I said to him, this is an experiment. I think this is going to work. By all the numbers, everything's going to work, but you have to do it. And we did, I gave him a few days to catch up on his calories. We didn't go from 1,800 to 5,000 overnight. But in just a few days, he felt so much better because he was released from this guilt that he couldn't eat anything.
Yeah.
And he trusted me. I mean, there was tremendous trust. Something very hard to get these days with clients because they're so, and I'm sure anyone listening to this knows that every client that comes in is coming to you, but they're also listening to a whole bunch of self-styled gurus telling them all kinds of things that are opposite to what you're telling them. And so gaining that trust today takes a little more work, but he followed through. His body responded, like I said, like I had never seen before. Dramatic changes in body composition, huge swings in a matter of 7 weeks. And then we had another weigh-in, I believe, 2 weeks later, something like that. And it was a profound change. Of course, he also had some dehydration. We had some other things going on that were in our favor, that made his body composition look worse at the beginning and look better at the end. However, that was nothing could explain away the changes that we saw. But because he didn't have the help he needed, he was traded. I think he finished the season. He did quite well. He was traded, and then he slid backwards into alcoholism. And it was, I think it took probably far too long for him to get the treatment he needed. Whereas I firmly believe today, had he had the treatment when I started with him, when he still was so receptive, and it hadn't been so long a period of time, I believe his outcome, I can't say for sure, but his outcome may have been different.
Yeah.
So, but as far as the nutritional experiment, just what we saw was pretty profound. And did I know it was going to work? I was pretty sure that if he did it, we were going to see good results. Would we hit the numbers? That I really had no idea.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I wonder, I mean, you were in a position where you had the evidence behind you with regards to muscle and what feeds and what fuels muscle. So when you come to a client like that and you can see the body composition changes and you've got that kind of background knowledge, whereas I feel like so many practitioners might have looked at that case and gone, well, he's clearly underreporting, or he's, there's something he's not telling me. And so we're going to have to really dial in those, nutrients, that is not the approach that you took, or at least certainly that's not what I read in the case study. And I will obviously link the case study because it is a fascinating one. And you wrote it up so well. It was very easy to kind of follow through and understand. And what I find interesting as well, Susan, is, at the time, and I know this was kind of early 2000s or similar.
I think I worked with him in 1999, I feel like.
Yeah. And, we think about sports nutrition principles, with the amount of training that he would have been doing, like with the amount of carbohydrate that would have been recommended, I wonder how much room there would have been for the eggs, for the nuts, for the brain foods, if you like, if you were to say, put him on 10 grams of carbohydrate per kg body weight, or what might have been recommended for someone of his, physical activity level. I don't know. It feels like your approach was quite unique in the focus on what fuels the brain and the muscle for an athlete, I suppose.
Well, and don't forget, I went to 5,000 calories a day. If you're eating 5,000 calories a day, you can get in all of the carbs and fats and proteins that you need, right? So, and I don't hold back when I'm working with an athlete. There's another, I think it's called the Hilliard talk. It's a video of me at Texas A&M doing a talk. It's kind of like the TED Talks of exercise physiology. They do a marvelous job. And I gave a talk. So you have, I think we had, I don't remember if it was 15 minutes or something. And the whole talk really comes down to never under fuel training.
Yeah.
Never under fuel training. Why would someone who has unless the goal of your training is just purely to burn calories? I've been scolded for using the term junk miles, but that there is no such thing as junk miles by some of my colleagues. But certainly there are lots of people out there that just they use a run or a rowing episode or something purely as a calorie burner. Even under that circumstance, you're going to burn fewer calories if you don't eat anything and you're underfueled going into it. You're just going to run out of fuel. And the last half of your training is going to be much lower caloric expenditure than had you fueled it to begin with.
Yeah.
However, the concept of underfueling training when you're trying to cut and you're still trying to keep high levels of performance is a complete contrast in mission and goals. You should never underfuel training. Now, if you want to, at that point where you have an athlete that is really in peak condition, they're in the middle of their season, which is the story that I'm telling about an athlete in that video, who then has to do an ESPN body shoot. She's going to be in the ESPN body issue. And so she's in the middle of her competitive season, working toward a WNBA championship, and she's got to get photo shoot ready. And so she calls me and says, Doc, I just want my abs more cut. And I said, so you're on a championship run to win the whole thing, to win your season, and you want to do a cut? Yes. And I said, okay, it's going to be 2 weeks. That's it. You don't need more than 2 weeks. Your body is in prime condition. But we're never going to underfuel your training. But we will scrape a little away around the margins at other ends of the day to get a very slight calorie reduction. And those calories were predominantly from carbohydrates at that time of the day. I may have moved them to just prior to around her training. So she didn't underfuel her training ever by carbs or game day, practice days, but that on the edges of her day, instead of we actually had some very small amount of decrease of calories, and carbs pretty much were it.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, she still was eating plenty of carbs, but we focused them all around pre, during, and post. Not completely all, but as I said, predominantly. And 2 weeks of that was more than enough for her body to respond exactly how she wanted it and what I had predicted. I've been doing this long enough to know that it doesn't take much, because our athletes, especially our female athletes, are so close to the margin of, there's just not a lot of calorie wiggle room between what they're consuming and what they utilize.
Yeah.
And so once, if you just drop the tiniest bit, you get a marked effect.
So have you got numbers? So for example, like, did you kind of calculate we need this amount around training, and then we need to shave off this amount across the course of a day? Because I guess the reason I ask is, you'll have LCHFers, people who are low carbohydrate, high fat, who kind of get scared of carbohydrate in amounts greater than, 50 grams per day, without recognizing the amount of carbohydrate that's required in training means that a quote unquote low carbohydrate load for one athlete might very well be moderate to high for someone who doesn't do that amount of training. So kind of what realm of carbohydrate would you have dropped out of that athlete's diet to have enabled that change over such a short period?
I would say, remembering exactly, I think I say exactly in the video, and it's also the case study is in the new Power Eating.
Awesome.
Maximum, it would be probably 75 grams a day.
Yeah.
Max.
Yeah.
Max. I would say it was probably closer to 50 to 60 grams of carb a day. That's all it took. That's 200 to 240 calories. Maybe I dropped her 300 calories.
Yeah.
And so in thinking about, and the amount of carb that she would eat around her training, she'd have about 105 grams of carb prior to a game. This is a carbohydrate supplement. I mean, this is pure carb just prior to the game. 70 to 105 grams, depending on how she was feeling. She'd have at least another 35 grams at halftime, and at least another 35 to 70 grams post game.
Mm-hmm.
Practice, most of her practices were not as intense as a game. But I mean, so she's consuming 800 to 1,000 calories of carbohydrate pre, during, and post recovery.
Mm-hmm.
Just as a picture. And so that was particularly because we had taken out a little bit around the edges of the day. She still needed the carbohydrate, but there is an effect by going through these hours. If she had, we created a very tiny deficit.
Yeah.
But her body is in high metabolic mode.
Yeah.
And so she got that tiny little extra fat burn that she wanted to get, but it didn't affect her performance because we limited it to 2 weeks. Had we gone longer, ultimately there would have been a performance effect.
Yeah. And I think, that it's such a good lesson in kind of sports nutrition, if you like, and just in both of those case studies really kind of tell us a little bit about that metabolic cost in training. If you remove the fuel in and around training, which a lot of, athletes do in this intention to improve body composition, because they feel like, well, if I need to burn fat, then I can't eat anything in and around training because that is going to impact on my ability to burn fat, without recognizing the whole metabolic cost of that effort is reduced. And in addition to that, probably the rest of the day, if it's done earlier in the day, energy adaptation that occurs because they're under fueling where they need to fuel all changes the ability to create that calorie deficit, because that's ultimately what you need to do, right?
Right, exactly. And so if your goal of your training is to enhance performance, the minute you underfuel your training, you create a performance deficit. And so your training is never going to get you where you want to go. And this is very often a common reason for a plateau.
Yeah.
Right. Because my diet is perfect. I've cut out all my carbs. I have no potatoes, no rice, and I'm not saying you have to eat potatoes and rice.
Yeah.
I'm just saying what gets reported, right? I don't do this. I don't do this. I don't do this. It's this world of scarcity and restriction. I'm training harder, but I'm getting softer. I'm training longer, but my performance is going down. I'm not sleeping well. I'm getting brain fog. Sometimes my hair is falling out. My skin looks terrible, but I'm doing everything right. What's happening to me? And I say, well, do you think it could be your diet? I mean, you're here. Well, it's impossible. It can't be my diet. I'm doing everything perfectly. And this is where I said to you, there are so many self-described gurus out there doing real harm. No athlete should take their nutrition advice from the diet world.
Yeah.
The diet world doesn't even know what it's doing with obesity and weight loss, let alone giving advice for sports performance.
Yeah.
And so the minute you underfuel your training, you are creating training deficits, meaning you are not working out as hard as it feels.
Yeah.
On your rate of perceived exertion. There are many studies that show that when you decrease calories and particularly decrease carbs, and you are trying to do high intensity exercise, and let's keep it at that because it's a different story if you're, as I said, just running slow miles. But if you're trying to do high intensity exercise, your rate of perceived exertion will go up.
Yeah.
But your watt output, your actual energy output, will go down. So it feels like you're working out at a 10, but you're really working out at a 6. And so on a scale of 1 to 10, right? Where 1 is sitting on a couch and 10 is puke or pass out. If you're feeling like you're at an 8 or a 9 and you have underfueled your training, you are not really, you really are perceiving that, but you're not training at that level. You're not getting the training effect of that hard work. So as one of my clients said to me many years ago, I can no longer waste my time in the gym, which is kind of what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting, isn't it? And, obviously carbohydrate is one thing. I don't know about your experience, Susan, but people I work with, athlete or otherwise, as an endurance athlete myself, I probably have half of my clients are athletes, but they undereat protein.
Oh, yes.
Because a lot of the rhetoric out there is really that everyone overeats protein because they're comparing protein intakes to the recommended daily allowance or dietary intake without sufficient thought or even the knowledge that actually, as an athlete and probably just a general person, needs more than that minimum threshold for survival.
Oh, and particularly female athletes, because many of them are restricting, and they just don't have. And sometimes it's not intentional. Sometimes it's lack of knowledge.
Yeah. And
the sense that I've eaten enough.
Yeah.
If I eat any more, I'm going to be too full to train.
Yeah.
And so that's what a registered dietitian can so help with that nobody else can do. Really translating the science of nutrition into food, into teaching people how to create a menu, how to separate and in a day get in the fruits and the vegetables and the nuts and the seeds and the protein foods and the grains and the beans. How do I get all that in a day and still be empty enough to train? Yeah. And this is where our knowledge not only helps with the distribution of food during the day, but also at what time is it advantageous to use engineered foods, scientifically designed products for use around exercise. And so that knowledge base is invaluable. And so that's where I think the training of a registered dietitian is unique, because we really understand how to translate that as well. The protein issue, I do, I haven't done it this year, obviously, but I teach at a medical school in South Vietnam. And I was honored to be invited to speak at an international conference in South Vietnam, in Saigon, regarding geriatrics and nutrition. And what was the single most important thing that I wanted to talk about? And it was protein.
Yeah.
How important protein is throughout our lifetimes, and how much as we age and we do start to cut out some foods, that protein-rich foods are really reduced in the diet. And it is very detrimental to our health. Sarcopenia is such a big problem. Protein is absolutely required for the maintenance of muscle, not to mention so many other important areas. And maintaining those activities of daily living are 100% dependent on having the muscle to do so. How does sports nutrition translate? Across the board.
Yeah.
If how can you stay active if you're not fueled enough at any age?
Absolutely. And, I'm part of a group that is putting on an international women's conference in March 2022, and our area is social change. I know, it really is, right? And, a couple of the different topics, one of them is how we encourage women who are getting into the master's years and beyond, how we encourage them to be active. And as a nutritionist, I'm on a kind of a board with a bunch of people who work in racial inequities and gender inequalities and things like that. And I'm sitting here thinking, how could I possibly contribute as a nutritionist? But when that topic came up, first and foremost, these women have to have the right nutrients to enable them to be active in the first place. Whereas so many people that you talk to just in general, everyday life, are underfueled in protein, and have, these things drive other eating patterns, which can cause metabolic disruption and disturbances and things like that. So it's that real kind of fundamental kind of fueling appropriately at all age groups, right? To enable us to continue to be active.
Right.
Yeah. So Susan, what does your diet look like?
So I've eaten the same sort of 3 different selections of breakfast for probably 30 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk me through them.
I have my, I love grains. And I have a whole, I'm kind of known for this whole grain thing that I'm on a whole shtick right now with it. It's critically important.
The sourdough bread.
Yes. And fresh flour, fresh flour, and the sourdough baking technique, how important that is of the live yeast and the fermentation, very important. So, but my typical breakfast, actually, I like all the different puffed cereals. I've always liked that. It's kind of a texture thing. I've always liked them. And so these days I'm eating a puffed Kamut. I have that. I grind flaxseed every morning in a little sort of dedicated Burr coffee grinder. So I always have flaxseed. I actually put creatine in. I have about 3 grams of creatine that I throw in there. And I'll have some kind of, berries or raisins and bananas, or, some kind of fresh fruit. And that, when I'm eating cereal, I have milk. And I am blessed with a body that has plenty of lactase. I have never, my whole family has been milk drinkers to our, old age. So, and I love milk. And so, I am a profound dairy consumer. So that's one breakfast. Another breakfast is a big bowl of Greek yogurt with all the same stuff in it.
Mhm.
It's just not, but without the cereal. And on that morning, I may have a slice of a really good whole grain bread, and always a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
So some mornings it's a latte. I make it home myself. Some days it's just black coffee. And then the other alternative to that is eggs. And so I'll have, I make sure to have at least 5 egg yolks a week, usually spread out as a whole egg plus a bunch of egg white.
Mm-hmm.
Then I also do have a slice of bread. I may have a glass of half orange juice and half sparkling water, something like that, and always coffee. So that's it. Like there is very, very little variation from that. And on the days that I have eggs, I don't have the flaxseed. So I often will then have the yogurt at lunch so I can get the flaxseed in there.
Yeah.
Or I'll make a smoothie and I put the flaxseed in there.
Nice. And what about lunch? What is lunch for you? Where do you do the same thing?
Yeah, so these days I don't do a snack between breakfast and lunch because I'm so sedentary, unfortunately. And I just am not even hungry. I drink a lot of fluids, but I don't feel like I have the need for a snack in between. Lunch can be anywhere from sort of a turkey sandwich to a salad with turkey, tuna salad. I have a wonderful tuna that we get here that is a local family. If you want, anybody wants it, you can't get it, I'm sure, in New Zealand, but it's tunatuna.com.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Italy, or sardines. I'm a big fan of sardines. So it'll be salad or a sandwich, that's kind of all over the place. Sometimes it's a smoothie that I know that I'm on my way somewhere. So I make that early, throw it in the fridge. And so that will have maybe some milk in it, some protein powder. Maybe the creatine goes in there for the day and the flaxseed. I put cocoa in there, sometimes peanut butter, some fruit. I mean, it's, sometimes avocado. It's just sort of what's around.
Yeah.
Spinach, who knows what'll go in there. And then sometime in the middle of the afternoon, I typically have some nuts, a small handful. I'm very partial to these. Again, this is from Vietnam, is where I was introduced to them. These cashews that still have, you may have them there, cashews that still have the skin on it.
Yes, I've just discovered these in the last 6 months. They are delicious.
Yeah, so that's that's become my delicious snack in the afternoon. Other times I can admit, sometimes I'll have some whole grain chips. Sometimes I have another slice of bread with some peanut butter, or some almond butter, just depends. And then dinner is typically some kind of vegetables or a bunch of vegetables, fish, chicken, tofu. I have a wonderful, marvelous Brazilian bean soup that we've been eating that I made. That's out of the Moosewood cookbook. Now I'm getting into more soup season. I am not a person that loves to spend hours and hours in the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
I find recipes that are fast and easy. All the recipes in all of my books are things that I actually make. But I do like to bake bread. And so that's often, until my freezer is so full that I need to stop baking and I start to use them.
Yeah.
I do on the weekends. I usually have a day that I'm baking and probably cleaning and doing work on the side or something like that. So those are kind of my days.
Nice. And in terms of working out, what are you currently doing? What's your schedule like?
Well, we're in this COVID haze here. I have to admit that I'm nowhere near as active as I was. And I don't mind saying that. I feel like I want to give grace to everybody out there. I was a real gym rat. And I'm also, in, as I say, the second half of my life. And I have no intention of working out in a gym with other people huffing and puffing, with or without masks. I'm just not going in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm still paying because I don't want them to go away, but I'm not going. And so it's kind of my philanthropy. So I am in the Pacific Northwest. We have wonderful hiking. So once a week, I force myself to get outside and hike.
Mm-hmm.
Or go for a good walk. You can just call it a good many hour outdoor walk.
Yeah.
In the urban setting. I have my bicycle on a trainer, and so I'll get on there. I had been religious with my strength training at home. I have enough of a smattering of stuff here. And that was during our closure. That was in April and May, and I was so good. And then I've kind of fallen off the wagon. But I have to say, for any woman who is looking for a good sort of, let me get back to what I know how to do, whether you're at a gym or you're home. I have it upstairs. Unfortunately, I don't have her book here. It's anyone, especially who's older. Amanda Thebe has just written Menopocalypse.
Okay.
Menopocalypse.
Yeah.
She has a fabulous training program in there. I just think it is so good for a do-it-yourself. I have been out of my training mode. I don't want to get hurt. I don't have a trainer. I want to do this at home. I think she's done a marvelous job, not to mention that the book is funny. She is a funny person. Do you know Amanda?
No, I don't. I've just written her name down though, so I'll put it in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, she also was a COVID long hauler.
Oh.
So someone who got COVID pretty early on and it wouldn't go away.
Oh, mate. Gosh.
She suffered symptoms for months.
Yeah.
She is a Brit who is in Canada. And she's a trainer and she's marvelous. And so for all the women of a certain age out there, all of us who are still going strong, but if you've fallen off the wagon and you'd like to get started again, that's a really good start.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Susan. As I said, I've got that down as a resource I'll pop in the show notes. And everyone is always super interested to hear what other people are doing. So, it was great that you were able to share some of your favorite meals and what you love including, and your creatine, your daily creatine. I love that as well. I've actually just started doing that over the last 3 or 4 months myself. And I just feel like,
oh, good.
With all of the evidence out there with regards to the brain and with bone and just with health, so worth it.
Oh yeah, I strongly recommend it. And if you're taking 3 grams a day, I mean, maybe you'll notice it in your head, but you're not going to get water retention or any of that. I mean, I have to say, people know I'm 63 years old. If I was going to get water retention from creatine, I'd get it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, everything. And I'm not, in the old days, how active I really was prior to COVID, and hot yoga, and just constantly really 6 days a week with an active rest day of all different kinds of heavy physical activity. That was different. But today, I'm still taking the creatine and there's just no difference. Yeah. No difference.
Nice. That's so good. Susan, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. It was so good to be able to connect with you. And as I say, you've got so much that you could share. Like the fact that we went through 2 case studies was just, so helpful, I think, for people listening to kind of further understand that intersect between sports nutrition, health and performance and body composition goals, because that really does kind of cover the gamut of what most people are looking for when they're thinking about their nutrition and thinking about how they can improve and what they're currently doing to get to a place where they want to be. And outside of those case studies, of course, you've got your book, The New Power Eating, and it's had about a gazillion editions or quite a few editions now. And also the Good Mood Diet, which I imagine that a large part of what we discussed with that case study, that information can be found within that almost little Bible of how to eat to support mood. So I'm definitely including that stuff in your show notes. And if people want to work with you, you're currently, you take clients, international, US, States. Is that the space you're in?
Yes. So from anywhere. Yeah. I have worked remotely for 30 years with clients from all over the world. Right now, I'm going to admit that my practice has shrunk down. I'm not working with as many individual clients because I have to be so much more available to them. And I sort of elected not to be quite that available, but I am a little bit of it. I'm still taking occasionally the client that I think would be fun to work with, honestly. I mean,
Nice.
that's, just to be totally blunt about it. And it's not, if I turn you away, it doesn't mean that I don't think you're fun. What it means is I don't think I can be available enough to meet the needs of the client. And there are some marvelous folks out there. There's here in Seattle, there is, other sports dietitians who are very good. So I have referred to some of them, but certainly feel free to reach out to me and see. I'm not certain yet, but as we are approaching the Olympics again, hold our fingers crossed, and all those are going to be some of the athletes that I've supported before that I want to make sure that I keep time for them, both the teams and the athletes. So that's why I'm hedging a little bit for right now.
No, it makes sense. And the best thing is, though, is that you've got these resources available so people can get the Susan experience when they jump on and they buy your books. So I just think that's fabulous.
Well, it's been marvelous to talk with you, Mikki. You're a fabulous host. I've thoroughly enjoyed this.
Oh, thank you, Susan. And I've really enjoyed it too. So you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you for your time. And it's been lovely to connect with you.
Thank you. I hope we talk again.
So that was my interview with Dr. Susan Kleiner. I really hope you enjoyed the conversation. And you can find Susan at drsKleiner.com or over on Instagram and Facebook at Power Eat. And she was really responsive to any of the messages that she gets and the inquiries she gets, and she just loves sharing information. In addition to that, you can find her books on all of the major online book distributors such as Amazon, Book Depository, and other such places. And next week, I have a super interesting conversation with Craig Emmerich from Maria Mind Body Health. Now, Craig is the often silent half of Maria Emmerich and the Keto Adapted website, and both Maria and Craig work really hard to bring some super solid information in and around the keto diet and also different approaches when keto doesn't work so well. And I caught up with Craig just at the start of this year, and him and Maria were on Maui, which is where they spend a lot of their time, and in part because of Craig's condition, which makes the colder weather super hard for him. So Craig was diagnosed with Lyme disease, and part of our conversation is actually in and around the diagnosis for Lyme, some of the pitfalls around the diagnostic tools that are used, and how he manages his Lyme on a day-to-day basis. So we delve into that, we delve into their keto approach, and we spend a bit of time talking about protein-sparing modified fasts, which is something I'm fascinated with and have used a little bit with clients too. So it's really great to have a conversation with someone else who really understands the science behind it. So until next week, team, if you enjoy the show, please head over to your favorite podcast platform and hit subscribe and leave a 5-star rating so more people can find out about Mikkipedia and enjoy the conversations that you've been enjoying on a weekly basis. You can find me on Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition, on Instagram and Twitter at Mikki Williden, and over on my website, mikkiwilliden.com, where you can connect with me and book in a consultation, sign up to one of my meal plans, which covers fat loss, real food nutrition, sports nutrition, and a keto longevity plan. And that is one of the best ways that you can support the show as well. So thanks for listening and have a great week.